United States on Kuwait. I've known Marianne since the mid-2000s when I was preparing to go to Kuwait to be U.S. ambassador there, and she kindly briefed me on developments in Kuwait in preparation for that posting. And we've kept up over the years a little bit, but Marianne's history with Kuwait goes back a long way, and she has been observing the evolution of the political system and the social system in that country for many years. She's now a professor emerita and living up there in the wilds of Vermont somewhere. We're not sure where. It's an undisclosed Vermont location, but we have her here on Google Hangout, and we're delighted to have her. But before we start talking about some of what's been going on in Kuwait recently, including their recent elections, I wonder, Marianne, if you might just tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in Kuwait and what sparked your interest and maintained it and sustained it over the years.
Well, I first got interested in Kuwait because of its oil. My dissertation was on the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, and that's where Kuwait, it's based in Kuwait. So I wanted to do a study of the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation because it was the first OPEC company to go downstream. And I thought, wow, this would be really interesting. So I had a Fulbright, and I was in Kuwait in the spring of 1990 during the pro-democracy movement, and I left shortly before the invasion. After the invasion, I found that I was much more tightly tied to Kuwait than I had thought. It was a really agonizing experience, I think, for anyone with friends in Kuwait. And after the liberation, I wanted to go back and see Kuwait get rebuilt. So my first election was the 1992 election, and I spent 2 months going to campaign events and watching the voting and learning about the procedure and learning a lot about Kuwaiti politics.
Well, I've looked through your multi-page CV, and it seems like Kuwait is mentioned at least 3 times on every page of that. And you've observed at least 4 or 5 Kuwaiti elections over the years. This last election in July seemed to me to be perhaps a little tamer than recent Kuwaiti elections. There was a partial boycott among some parties, including the party that represents, or the grouping that represents the Muslim Brotherhood in Kuwait. But things seem to have calmed down a little bit after the more energetic political climate of 2011 in Kuwait. And I wonder what's you were there observing those elections, as you have many others. What did you take away from your time there in Kuwait watching this most recent electoral round?
Well, I think that it's complicated. To give you sort of a snarky answer, I think the Emir has finally figured out that the best time to have an election in Kuwait is in the middle of the summer during Ramadan, because people have so many other things to do that even the ones who are very political have a limited amount of time to devote to political activities. Not that they weren't paying attention and doing things that needed to be done. The other thing is that I think Kuwaitis on the whole, no matter where they stand on the issues that have really disturbed Kuwait for the past several years, are sorting things out right now. They would like to be able to see which way to go. They feel themselves very much embedded in a region where Arab Spring events are both reflected in what they're doing and also shaping what they're doing as well. For example, the position of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brothers in Kuwait, has just dropped like a stone. And I think part of that is because of the participation of the Ikhwan in the opposition and in the canceled 2012, February Parliament, but also because of what's happening in Egypt.
Marianne, I noticed that the new Speaker of the Parliament comes from a traditional business family. Also, some of the tribal elements have shown better showing in this election than they had previously. Is this a bit of a return to the traditional politics of the Kuwaiti parliament, the traditional players? I noticed the Shia lost a few votes. I think there's still 2 women in the parliament, but it looks more like what you might traditionally expect from a Kuwaiti parliament, a little more stable, a little more old-fashioned groupings reasserting themselves.
Well, I think to some extent that really is true. My impression overall of this election, or the results of the election, is that it was normal. We had a very broad distribution of groups represented in the parliament, and I think maybe because of the calm, although I have to say that things weren't calm in 1992, and they weren't all that calm in 1996, and even in 2003. So there's been a lot of upheaval associated with elections. But in a very strange way, it is normal, and yet it's not. What we see are the children and grandchildren of the older people who used to dominate the parliament before the first, well, maybe before the second shutdown. 1980 is a good dividing line. The other thing is that the people who are in the parliament now, I think at almost every level, are very determined to make big changes, structural changes in the way Kuwait operates. They have very different ideas about that, but they also seem to be much more willing to talk to one another than has been the case with opposing groups in the parliaments I have observed since 1992.
That's interesting and hopeful, because Kuwait has really developed a reputation in the region for just stagnating politically and economically, and it's a tragedy given that there's such a dynamic, well-educated population. I wanted to come back to a theme we've discussed before, and that's the role of youth in Kuwait. There was a period in the last couple of years when it looked like youthful activists with some guidance from their senior mentors were really sort of setting the agenda in Kuwait, and we're going to have a permanent and lasting impact. I've always thought, at least I've thought for several years, that youth is fleeting and highly overrated. But what do you think? I mean, was this a flash in the pan, or are those people going to be, have they cut their teeth now? Are they going to be different kinds of political actors, different kinds of political leaders as they emerge into different roles in the polity and the society?
Well, one thing about youth is that they get old, and so the people who are the young ones that you look at, 5 years from now, they're going to be more grown up, they're going to have more skills, they are going to have different views of how they should get involved in politics. I think of someone like Khalid Al-Fadallah, who was one of the organizers of the Orange Movement in 2006, very much, sort of a student radical or a immediately post-student radical out in the streets doing things. And he and his friends have become much more, maybe you'd call it, political operatives. They're much more engaged in political organization, in building coalitions across different groups. They have very good skills. They don't all agree on everything, but they already are. Youth already is in the system. I think that when people talk about youth, especially in the context of Kuwait and the demonstrations that took place in the 2 years before this election, they're thinking of young kids from the tribes. And that is really not what they should be thinking of. The people who organized and participated in the demonstrations, there was a very broadly based movement. A lot of urban Kuwaiti youth and sort of 20, 30-somethings and 40 and 50-somethings. I was in the last Dignity March on the 30th of November last year. And there were grandmothers and people with baby buggies. So we really are looking at, I think, a very different approach to politics by Kuwaitis as a whole. It reminded me a lot of mobilization in Turkey, which also is going across groups. And sometimes this happens below the radar. We get very bad reporting on the Middle East in the United States, and you sort of get this one flash picture that is filled with 15 facts and 18 errors, and you're supposed to make sense out of this, and you only get them every few weeks. So I think that it's not surprising that people don't know that much about what's going on, but I think they should also apply what is going on in their own country and in their own lives to try to analyze what possibly is going on in other countries as well, like Kuwait.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to ask you about, you've had a long-term interest in the role of women in Kuwait, the political dynamic that has emerged with women becoming more activist in Kuwait. When I was there, I always was struck by how successful Kuwaiti women were in almost every field in which they entered, and how educated they were, and how their level of achievement was very high. And when they finally got the vote in 2005, it was almost sort of icing on the cake. It wasn't. It was a right that was one of the few they didn't have already, or at least an activity that they were denied, but they weren't denied much else, it seemed to me. But how would you evaluate these days the role of women in politics in Kuwait?
Well, I think I would disagree with you a little bit on Kuwaiti women having every right. There are still very large stumbling blocks that have to do with personal status laws that I think still loom very large in Kuwait. You don't see this very much, and just from the surface, but they're very, very important, and they limit a lot of what women can do. Another thing that to me was maybe not so surprising as it might have been, is that Kuwaiti women are Kuwaitis, and Kuwaitiness really does trump gender. Kuwaiti women in politics behave just like Kuwaiti men in politics. So you've got really forthright, honest, exemplary women, and you've got women who are not forthright, honest, and not particularly above board in what they're doing. I think that the combination of the personal status laws and a decision that was made by those first 4 women who were elected in 2009 not to focus on a feminist agenda. Women at this point, the women who have gotten into power don't seem like advocates for women's rights or family rights or things that many Kuwaitis expected them to push for. So in a way, they've taken themselves out of being gender representatives, and they are going to have to fight as Kuwaitis. And there, they have these stumbling blocks that come into effect because they are women, there are different expectations, there are limits on what they can do, however tacit they may be. So I think the struggle is going to be very much as it was here. We had women in the Congress very early on after the vote, and it took Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas to really get people to take a look at how disadvantaged women were.
Interesting. One of the things I'm hearing from Kuwait these days is that people are fixated on what's going on in Egypt, and I think that's true for anywhere in the region. I mean, the horror and tragedy of what's gone on in the last week or so, and the rapid sort of tempo of strange events in that country. How do you think people apply that to the Kuwaiti experience? What's the meaning of the Egyptian the developments there in Kuwait?
From the people I talked to, there's a tremendous amount of compassion for the Egyptian people. And as I noted earlier, there's been a real turning away from the Muslim Brothers. They're seen by a lot of Kuwaitis as kind of a focal point of the difficulties. On the elite side, all the Gulf governments are very much supporting the military, and I think that you could think of an authoritarian regime union or whatever. They're all sticking together no matter what it looks like. And I think that this will add to the complications. The Kuwaitis have just announced a policy of basically closing down on visas for people from Egypt. And I think that the fear of contamination is there, at least in the minds of people who are making policy. So I think that in Kuwait, as it is in many other places, people are concerned, they're upset, they don't really know what to do. They don't want to be dragged into something that might be disastrous for them, but they don't want to be so unengaged that they can't be helpful. So it's just it's a dilemma. It's a horrible dilemma.
You know, you bring to light this notion of sort of the politics of fear, and we see it also not only in relation to expatriate communities like the Egyptians, who play a huge role, of course, in the Kuwaiti and other Gulf economies, but also in the attitude towards Shia, which seems to be getting worse and worse with exclusion of people and expulsion of people from various Gulf countries, and sort of this rapid campaign against Hezbollah. Did you sense that? Did you get a feel for that when you were in Kuwait?
I think this is where Kuwait does a whole lot better than its neighbors, and maybe this is because of the size of the Shi'i minority. You've got 30%, so these are people who are very much embedded in every aspect of Kuwait's way of life, and yet they have no possibility of being a majority or dominating. So you can include them without having to be scared of them. The last nullified parliament, the one that was elected in December, had 17 Shi'i members, which really freaked a lot of Sunni Kuwaitis out. But by the same token, they didn't push for the kinds of things that people that, oh, well, you know, we're going to have Ashura be a holiday and all of these things. Nothing like that happened. And I think, if anything, it may have quieted down the hostility that I have to say is being stoked by a number of political forces in Kuwait, where you have one group or another that's being held up as the monster of the moment. But I think in terms of sectarianism, Kuwait does a much better job, and Kuwaitis are much less likely to be sucked into that. Not all, but many, most maybe I would even say.
Marianne, it's always good to talk to you because you bring such a sense of perspective and both immediate and historical knowledge to any conversation about Kuwait. As we both know, we don't get much news about Kuwait in the United States, and the news we do get is largely out of context. I noticed when I did a Google News search for Kuwait recently that the news you do see, interestingly, is the news of American troops either coming back or going to Kuwait, and still in a steady stream. Kuwait still provides a base or several bases for U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy. It's been a good, steady ally, and that story is largely untold unless you're part of a military family in which Kuwait has played a big role over the last several years. But anything else that you would highlight about U.S.-Kuwait relations that we ought to be paying more attention to?
I think we have to pay a lot more attention because for many, many years we've taken Kuwait for granted. We think of Kuwait as being dependent because of our role in mobilizing the rollback of the Iraqi invasion. And we really have taken for granted the largesse from Kuwait, you know, not just you can have your base here, but let us give you oil, let us provide all of these things for you. And I don't think that there is the same acceptance of the United States and the American role. When I talk to people in Kuwait, they are much more critical of U.S. policy than they have been in the past. They're critical not simply with regard to Egypt. It's hilarious with Egypt. The people who are for Morsi think what happened is all the Americans' fault, and the people who are for the military regime think it's all the Americans' fault. You know, so we're still the the evil force in the world, I suppose. But there isn't this automatic or maybe I can say that a result of a somatic experience. Years ago, Kuwaitis were grateful to the Americans because they remembered everything, and Americans came and rescued them. When I went to Kuwait after liberation, Skip Ghanim was the ambassador then, and he said, "I have the only embassy in the Middle East that has pro-American graffiti," and he was right. And that feeling lasted for a long time. It isn't there anymore, and it started to go away in 2004. The exposure of the abuses in Iraq, that Kuwaiti kids drove to Fallujah to fight against the Americans in November. The difference in opinion, and of course now with the two Kuwaitis who are still in Guantanamo, and this is what Kuwaitis think of and remember as well. And the invasion and liberation is far away. The kids in prison are there today, and there's a whole different context for the development of attachment or detachment from the United States in Kuwait.
I agree with you completely that attitude is much more skeptical. It was much more skeptical, as you said, when I first got there, and that was 2004 to 2007, and it was clear that the only way you could really shift any attitudes about the United States among young people was to actually send them to the United States to look for themselves at the diversity here and the differences of opinion in our own society. And so one of my main goals was to increase the number of Kuwaiti students and visitors to the United States at that time, and I think those numbers have gone up a bit. But I think we'll end our conversation on that note, that you do have to cultivate these relationships. They don't take care of themselves, and both government and NGOs, universities, and all of us have to work at it to make it work. And I really appreciate you working with us on this first ever Google Hangout for both of us. It seems to have taken place without major technical difficulties once we got started. And so
it feels more like Google Hangman to me, but I had more technical difficulties than met the eye. But we overcame them all, every last one.
You're a trooper, and we really appreciate it. And we'll let you get back to the more prosaic interests you might have there at your place in Vermont, and appreciate again you taking the time to be with us.
You're quite welcome.